Hello, I'm Stewart Campbell, and the team at Oxford Leader have asked me to share a video talk with you about my current doctoral research project, which is taking place jointly between Oxford Leader and the University of Birmingham. However, I'm currently locked away doing my social distance song from my home in London. Some of you have already participated in my research project at some point, so are aware to some extent about what my research project is about. But for those unfamiliar, my research project, Songs Without Borders, takes art song and investigates it as live audience experience. And what I mean by that is I'm interested in the ways that individuals engage with songs and how they construct their own realities of live songs in the concert hall. We don't go to the concert hall and receive a literal copy of songs in our heads. I don't believe songs just sort of magically jump from the score to the musicians and automatically simply transfer to our brains as consumers of art song. But instead, we are more active agents of our own perceptions. And you might want to think about our relationship with songs more as a negotiation between us as human beings, songs themselves, and external environments. Because when we engage with song in the concert hall, we collect information and data from a really complex network of sources. The music itself, our own interpretation of a poem, our own perception of a singer's voice, the tone, an appraisal between the relationship between a pianist and a singer, what people are wearing, how we're using translation resources, our own previous encounters with a song, a composer, an artist, our own music and linguistic competencies. The list is absolutely endless. And we create our own complex interpretive song worlds from this information, and these have the potential to be shared, differ enormously from person to person and context to context. So I'm really interested in what shapes our live art song encounters. I'm really interested in how individuals describe their encounters with song, their pathways into song, what they prioritize and what they neglect when talking about their encounters with song, the language they use to describe these encounters, and the ways they evaluate and judge their experiences of live song in the concert hall. It's a 3-year project, of which I'm exactly at the halfway point, which is absolutely petrifying. But given I'm at this midpoint milestone, I thought I'd spend some time talking about some of the things I've been thinking about and doing so far. My work can really be divided into sort of 2 chunks, and therefore the presentation that follows has 2 sections. First was really work on getting to grips with existing literature and studies relevant to art song as live audience experience. While self-isolating and stockpiling might be a new concept for many of us today, as a PhD student, I've been doing this for the best part of a year and a half now, so I'm an absolute pro. But instead of stockpiling sort of pasta and tinned tomatoes, I thought I'd just show you some of the things I'm currently stockpiling at the moment. There we go. And just showing this pile really just to show and say my work is quite multidisciplinary. It draws upon studies and concepts from musicology, scholarship about the songs themselves, audience research and the sociology of music and how human beings interact with live music, and translation studies. Translation is a determinant part of the song experience, be that translating poetry into song text, translating words into music, and translating from one language to another. And all of this thinking really combines to make up the first chapter of my thesis and the first chunk of work I'm going to talk to you about today. And the second chunk of work was really designing and implementing my study. So thinking about my relationship with the research practically and philosophically, and the methods and specific tools used to tackle my research, but also things like ethics. Working with human subjects brings another number of ethical challenges which needed to be worked through and thought about carefully. So planning for actually doing my research makes up the second chapter of my thesis, and I talked to you about some of my approaches to research today. And these approaches, of course, led me to eventually work with you. And that's this stockpile here. So many of you participated in questionnaires, wrote diaries of your experiences at the festival, and took part in sort of follow-up interviews, which I'm enormously grateful for, because excitingly, this has resulted in a not insignificant amount of language data for me to analyse, just shy of 290,000 words of people talking about how they interact and relate to live art song in the concert hall. And the analysis part of this is still very much work in progress, but I have some initial sort of emerging thoughts, which I'm keen to dig deeper into over the coming months, which I'll share with you today. So 2 things to talk about today. First, some of the thinking behind my research, and secondly, some of the doing and what's come out of it so far. So in terms of current thinking and navigating existing studies and literature which might be relevant to live art song as audience experience, I started asking the question, what is an art song? And a couple of you were actually quite candid in expressing dissatisfaction in my use of the term. And I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think art song is a problematic term. It's not one I particularly like, but I think I did need to find a way to distinguish between the type of songs we do here and make here at Oxford Leader and other forms of song. And from sort of researching around this, I arrived at a working definition of an art song as a form that features music and poetry, is often written for accompanied voices, and performed in the classical music genre. And you might be thinking that's absolutely blindingly obvious, or even rather identify works that completely fall through the cracks. But I think the point to make is there is no common definition of the term, and actually definitions of art song in literature are laden with value judgments and are culturally inflected. For example, art song is often defined as being a serious form, a more professional form, which sort of infers a higher status than sort of lesser forms of vocal music, and what even are lesser forms of vocal music. We're all familiar with subcategories of art song as German lieder, French melody, Spanish canción, which certainly highlight language boundaries for sure, but also the cultural specificity that really shape and actually complicate definitions of the genre and complicate our relationships with the art form. We can agree that songs combine words and music, but understandings of how they do so are highly contentious within existing literature. Do words and music combine to create something completely separate and new in form? And if they do so, do the constituent parts of words and music gain something to create something superior, or does the poem lose something in that process? We love to talk about this miracle marriage between words and music when we talk about song, but is it actually possible that words and music can coexist in sort of harmonious relationship as equal components within a song? Some authors have said yes, they absolutely can, and a poem can of course retain its own life, its own body, its own soul, as can music. But some have suggested no, music swallows words, words feed music, it's more hierarchical, music trumps words. Others have flipped this and see music's role as supporting and signifying the text, music at the bottom, kind of emphasising, bringing out the text. And I'm sharing some of these examples with you, and there are many, many, many more, because what this shows us is definitions of songs and conceptualizations of how songs are made up are really, really very messy. And whilst this at first might seem a bit sort of nitty-gritty and pedantic, what I'm most interested in is, if you think about it, the way we as listeners and audience members conceive subjectively and often very subconsciously the very basic premise of what songs are and how songs work, what we prioritise, what we attach value to, what we shun, has a significant impact on how we construct our own interpretations of song realities in our heads. So it's been really interesting for me to dig around some of the scholarly treatment of these issues and word-music relations, because even more interestingly for me, whilst we might take this for granted, your own definitions and conceptualizations as part of this research as to what really happens here are likewise really, really messy in the nicest, bestest possible way. So that was a starting point, trying to initially understand what a song is. My thinking then moved to broader issues of what we do with songs in the concert hall. And whilst on the surface we celebrate art songs' intimacy, its simplicity, its directedness, certainly compared to more overtly large-scale multimodal art forms and sort of spectaculars, as I've suggested, there's an awful lot that goes on in terms of what we hear, what we listen to, what we focus on, the choices we make in processing auditory information in musical terms, but critically language and translation. And at the heart of all these choices are questions around what we as human beings actively do with the materials we counter that make up a song experience, and why do we do so? So part of my work here was thinking about why we organise these materials today with regard to performance, production and reception, and much of this derives from 19th century performance practices for sure. But beyond what art song actually looks like, if you think about it, art song oozes with habitual practices that impact how we interact with the genre. Rules, rituals, behaviours, patterns, norms, attitudes that really govern and shape our experience. Coughing, clapping, rustlings of programmes, acceptable or blasphemous translation practices are a few really, really very top level obvious examples here that are so deeply embedded, yet so often taken for granted, yet have a significant impact on art song as live audience experience, as evidenced from my research. So from starting with trying to define an art song, widening out to issues about what we actively do with songs in the concert hall, my thinking broadened even further still to reflect on the kind of attitudes and perceptions of the genre as a whole. And within contemporary media and criticism, song gets a really tough time. It's a hard sell, it's an endangered species, it's hanging by a thread. But I've identified literature from the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, talking about the death of the song recital and what on earth are we going to do about it. Yet it's still here, you are all still here. I'm making this video right now. So what's going on there? Something not quite right there. Moreover, commentators have recently observed a resurgence of song in the UK with a growing number of programmes dedicated to the genre. You've only got to trawl social media this week, and indeed the Oxford Leader website, to see live art song returning from the concert hall to its domestic roots in the home, with videos of art song coming from sort of people's living rooms and kitchens and things like that. So the societal perceptions and attitudes towards art song as a genre in the UK are somewhat murky and, of course, shift. And I guess what I'm really getting at is we've not paid an enormous amount of attention to these human and social aspects of art song today in our research thus far. How is it when we talk about songs as having a profound emotional connection, mirroring the human condition, being at the core of the human psyche, that the brilliant, amazing research we have on songs so far predominantly focuses on historical perspectives, or sought to analyse song within the confinements of the printed score. If art song is so human, so personable, the relationships humans have with song as audience members represents a not insignificant gap in knowledge, in my opinion. And to tackle some of these issues, we can look to audience research as a discipline as a whole, but specifically developing work in other classical music audiences, in chamber music, opera, orchestral music, contemporary classical music, but also theatre studies. And this encourages us to think about ideas. What does it even mean to be in audience? What is an art song audience? And on the surface, we might look around the Holywell Music Room or other venues and think about song audiences as being silent, sort of passive receivers of song who are mostly well-behaved. But given everything I've talked about so far, on the contrary, we might consider us as being way more active, way more dynamic. And are we we's in audiences, or are we a group of I's? And what's the relationship with those around us? In reading your accounts and your interactions with song, your interactions with others, and really the assumptions you make around those around you really shape your engagement with song. And the concept and structure of a festival and the relationship we have with the festival really impact and shape our experience of live song. So the interpretive song worlds we construct from the musical, physical, intellectual, social, personal materials and resources we access when we engage with song are multifaceted and complex, and there's an awful lot going on. So having considered some of the literature and thinking, I'm now going to go and talk about some of the planning and doing stuff and how I've designed this study. And I think the crucial point to make here is I can only approach this research from interpretation. It's my research job to interpret how you interpret live song as a phenomenon. And it's this basic tenet which has informed the choices I've made in the design of this study and my methods. And I've chosen a specific methodology called interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is IPA for short. And it's great that it's IPA for short because I don't have to repeatedly say the word phenomenological in presentations like this, which I clearly have great difficulty in doing so. IPA was originally and initially intended for research in psychology, but has subsequently been applied to a number of disciplines. IPA requires me as a researcher to produce in-depth first-person accounts from research participants, which I did using all your brilliant questionnaire data, festival diaries, and follow-up interviews. This was really important to me as I wanted to capture people's perspectives before, during, and after the events themselves. And I've talked about how we construct complex interpretive song worlds based on multiple resources and information. But these resources and information aren't always in the immediacy of consumption in the concert hall. They're shaped by previous experience and knowledge and baggage, and that obviously informs what we sense and the decisions we make, conscious and subconscious, in the concert hall. But then these experiences are then integrated into sort of future experiences and shape future encounters. So it's really important to me to have that kind of snapshot of before, during, after the events themselves. So over the past few months, my work has involved me going through the data set for each participant and initially analysing three things. First, some descriptive work, kind of analysing the content or sentiment of what's been said. Second, some linguistic work, analysing the specific language employed, thinking about things like metaphor and sort of terms and phrases you've used to describe your song encounters. And third, conceptual works of analysing how what you said might relate to theoretical knowledge. And this takes place on a line-per-line basis. And eventually I've reduced this to a series of codes. And a code could be things like translation habits, a focus on gesture and body language, transcendent engagement, three random examples. And I've got some specialist software which helps me attach codes to each piece of data. I then look for patterns, which are called themes, and try to identify what fits, what doesn't fit, and the interrelatedness between these themes. And this happens for each participant, one per one. And I build a series of case files for each person. There are 20 in total, and this phase of the analysis is now done. And then the same process is repeated across multiple cases. So then I'm examining not from the participant level, but the whole data set, which I'm currently doing now. And after tidying up, there are currently about 170 codes across the whole data set, which are referenced across over 2,000 lines of data. I look for them further sort of patterns and convergence and divergence within the data set as a whole, which I'm currently doing, and sort of clustering these themes to help me make an overall picture. And all this data emerges from the bottom up. I have very little control over what comes out of this. There's a lot to write about here, and probably too much for my thesis actually. There's work to be done in identifying which parts to focus on now, which parts will sort of require future analysis and research beyond the scope of my PhD project. So to conclude then, just a few things that I'm sort of starting to think about moving forward. There's some really interesting stuff around identity coming out of the dataset quite strongly. The ways identities are constructed and how we negotiate and build performer identities when constructing our song worlds. We make up professional identities, which comprise of things like observations of technical ability, status as a musician, a hierarchy of musicians, stage presence, our observations and understanding what a model musician is or what a model leader singer is. But at the same time, we also build real people, and we think about things whether performers are nice or personable or funny or affable. We express pleasure in having opportunities to meet musicians after a performance, and we have a desire for musicians to speak to audiences in performance to create an increased human connection. So that's very different from a professional identity. But identity features are also derived from poetic content. We have observations of musicians metaphorically shape-shifting, becoming someone or something else present in these worlds of song, or feelings from a given song at a given time. So this isn't as simple as X and Y are performing Schubert. And what is interesting to me is how we as audiences prioritise some elements of these identities over others at any given time in quite dynamic ways during our song encounters. And these identities can be enforced and maintained through a number of ways in the data set, through gender, through gesture, through dress. The national and the international, these can be constructed before a specific concert takes place by listening to music or reading reviews and biographies and things. But through previous experience and knowledges, for example, perceptions of French singers choosing not to emote words, which might in turn enforce Frenchness as an identity in that experience. And these things materialise in events themselves, not just through performance, but through production. As I say, reading biographies and photographs in a programme, they look like X, they've done Y, so they're obviously Z. And all this work takes place before the singers even open their mouth or the pianists even touch the keys. And then there's our own identity as audiences and how we identify, and the relationship between self and what's going on around us is really fascinating. Asking people to talk about the process of what happens to song in the concert hall and where they as audiences fit into that reveals some really radically different ideas and concepts, all tied up with how individuals identify as audience members and their role in the song experience. So that's some sort of first area of work I want to sort of explore a bit further. Secondly, I've talked about the complexity of song and how I'm not unsurprised then that individuals had very different observations of the same experience. But I am interested in how those who participated in the study describe their song experiences in very different ways, of course, but they do so in a very consistent manner. They consistently notice and critique the same elements and features of their song encounters, while ignoring or choosing not to comment on other elements, and very, very rarely deviate from this. For example, we have things like technical engagement, which sees some participants observing and critiquing very technical musical elements to the micro level of specific bars and specific phrases, and rarely paying attention to things like words, visual elements, feelings, and emotions. And that's very different from sort of transcendent engagement, where the relative success of a song and the descriptions of song experience are based purely on an ability of a song to move the participant, or take the participant somewhere else. So sensing song, feeling song, and then establishing an emotional connection with the performance is paramount, ignoring all the sort of technical stuff I've just talked about. And as I say, I'm not surprised that these happen, but they are so consistent. And given they are so consistent, we might think of these as sort of strategies of engagement or frames that we unconsciously build, that help us navigate and find a way sort of through these complex interpretative song worlds to create meaning in our experiences. And I've then been thinking about how this might relate to ideas of focus and theories of attention, and how we might spotlight our attention and focus to sort of find meaning in these song encounters. And there are enormous questions there moving forward. So two very brief ideas for possibly very much larger areas of inquiry over the next few months. And I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for taking an interest in watching this, and thank you again so much to those who participated in my research. As always, I'm really happy to chat about any of this, and I've added my contact details at the end of this video. Enjoy the rest of your social distance song, and I look forward to seeing some of you digitally or in person soon. Thank you.